The airport buzzed with the usual rhythm of travel, passengers weaving through terminals, rolling suitcases clicking against polished floors, flight announcements cutting through the steady hum of conversations. Among the sea of travelers, Eleanor Brooks, a 78-year-old retired school principal, moved with quiet grace. She had spent decades shaping young minds, instilling confidence, and teaching dignity. Today, however, she would face a lesson of her own, one she had encountered many times before but never ceased to disappoint her. Eleanor had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Her son, Jonathan Brooks, had insisted she fly first class for the long journey, a well-earned luxury after a lifetime of service to her community. As she approached the gate for Clear Sky Airways Flight 628, she clutched her neatly folded first-class boarding pass in one hand and her elegant leather handbag in the other. She had dressed as she always did for travel, with poise and precision. A tailored navy blazer, a crisp white blouse, and a string of pearls that had been a gift from her late husband. But as Eleanor handed her ticket to the flight attendant at the entrance of the jet bridge, she noticed the first flicker of hesitation. The woman, whose name tag read Lisa Garrett, barely glanced at the pass before offering a strained smile. "First-class boarding is through here," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of forced politeness. Eleanor gave a polite nod and stepped forward, but as she did, Lisa's eyebrows furrowed slightly, her eyes flicking between the boarding pass and Eleanor's face. There was something there, a moment of doubt, a silent assumption being formed, but Lisa said nothing more and allowed Eleanor to pass. She had seen that look before. As Eleanor stepped into the first-class cabin, she took in the plush seats, the soft lighting, and the scent of fresh linen mixed with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee. It was a small oasis of luxury, a place meant for comfort and ease. But almost immediately, Eleanor felt something shift in the air. The passengers already seated in first class barely spared her a glance, engrossed in their tablets, newspapers, or quiet conversations. Yet, there was an undercurrent of awareness. A few stolen glances, a momentary pause in someone's conversation, an unreadable expression from a businessman seated near the front. Eleanor knew better than to dwell on it. She had lived long enough to understand the quiet language of exclusion, the way some people needed only a few seconds to decide that someone didn't quite belong. She found her seat, 4A, near the window and settled in. As she placed her handbag neatly by her feet, another flight attendant, Claire Matthews, moved down the aisle, greeting the first-class passengers with bright smiles and effortless charm. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reynolds. So lovely to see you again," Claire chirped as she handed a glass of champagne to an older gentleman in a tailored suit. She moved smoothly to the next passenger, engaging in small talk, adjusting a seatbelt, offering warm reassurances. Eleanor waited, expecting the same greeting, the same effortless hospitality, but Claire barely looked at her. Instead of a friendly smile, Eleanor was met with a fleeting glance, a perfunctory nod, and nothing more. No welcome aboard, no "can I get you anything?" Not even the champagne that the other passengers had received without asking. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap, her composure unshaken but her awareness sharp. It was small, subtle, but unmistakable. She was being treated differently. Moments later, Claire returned, carrying a silver tray of refreshments. She stopped at each row, offering drinks before passengers even had to ask. The businessman to Eleanor's left received a chilled flute of champagne. The woman across the aisle was handed a glass of sparkling water with lemon. When Claire finally reached Eleanor, she didn't offer her a choice. Instead, she placed a small bottle of water on Eleanor's tray table, without a glass, without ice, without a word. Eleanor glanced at the bottle, then at Claire, who was already moving away. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, her voice gentle but steady. Claire paused, turning back with mild impatience, as if she had expected Eleanor to accept what she had been given without question. "Yes?" Eleanor lifted the bottle of water slightly, her eyebrows raised. "I noticed the other passengers were given a selection of beverages. May I have a glass of champagne, please?" For half a second, Claire hesitated. It was quick, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression, but Eleanor caught it. Then, with a practiced smile, Claire replied, "Oh, of course, I'll be right back." It took 10 minutes before the champagne arrived. By then, Eleanor had already seen enough to understand exactly how this flight was going to go. As the flight crew continued their service, Eleanor felt the subtle but deliberate distance between herself and the attendants. Every interaction carried an undercurrent of doubt, a slight hesitation before responding to her requests, an unspoken question lingering in their eyes. "Are you sure you belong here?" They never said the words out loud. They never refused her service outright. But the small slights accumulated like drops of water filling a glass, until it was undeniable. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. Her presence in first class was a problem for them. Not because she had done anything wrong, not because she had asked for anything unreasonable, but because, to them, she simply didn't fit their expectation of who a first-class passenger should be. And that, more than anything, was the heart of the issue. Eleanor sighed softly and reached for her handbag, her fingers grazing the phone inside. She had spent decades teaching young minds about fairness, dignity, and standing up for what was right. And today she would have to teach that lesson again, not in a classroom, not with students, but at 35,000 feet, where injustice was playing out in the quietest, most insidious way possible. And this time, someone would have to answer for it. Eleanor Brooks sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap as the plane settled into cruising altitude. Outside the small oval window, the sky stretched endlessly, a vast canvas of blue that seemed almost untouched by the weight of the world below. But inside this first-class cabin, Eleanor was all too aware of the subtle but deliberate ways she was being made to feel unwelcome. She had endured quiet discrimination before, too many times to count, but at 78 years old, she had also learned how to carry herself with unshakable dignity. She had not reached this point in life by being weak, nor had she spent decades teaching young minds about fairness, only to let herself be diminished now. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, tending to passengers with warm smiles and effortless charm, Eleanor reflected on the lifetime of strength that had brought her here. Born in the segregated South, Eleanor had learned early on that the world often saw her as less than. She grew up watching her parents work twice as hard for half the recognition. Her mother, a school teacher, spent her evenings grading papers by candlelight, while her father, a factory worker, came home every night with his hands stained by grease and exhaustion. They had taught her the value of education, resilience, and standing tall in the face of adversity. She carried those lessons with her into adulthood, breaking barriers as a teacher, then a principal, and finally a district superintendent. She had spent decades ensuring that children, especially those who looked like her, received the education they deserved. She had faced skepticism, resistance, and outright hostility along the way, but she had never backed down, and she wouldn't start now. Sitting in her first-class seat, she exhaled slowly, reminding herself that this was nothing new. The flight attendant's dismissiveness, the delayed service, the questioning glances, she had encountered them all before. She had spent a lifetime navigating spaces where people subtly, or not so subtly, tried to push her aside. They were waiting for her to shrink. She never would. Her late husband, Charles, had once told her that true power was not in how loud one spoke, but in how well one carried themselves. People like us don't have the luxury of losing our temper, he had reminded her once, after a particularly infuriating meeting with a board of directors who had underestimated her. But that doesn't mean we let them win. She had taken his words to heart. Eleanor had mastered the art of waiting, of observing, of choosing her battles carefully. She never reacted in anger. That was what people like these flight attendants expected. Instead, she strategized, letting people reveal their true nature before she made her move, and today, she would do the same. Across the aisle, the young businessman who had received his champagne without asking was already on his second glass. The woman 2 rows ahead had just been offered a warm towel and a refill of sparkling water. And yet, Eleanor's own request for a simple drink had been deliberately ignored for over 15 minutes. She had noted every detail. The way the head flight attendant, Claire Matthews, had hesitated before serving her. The way she had pretended not to notice Eleanor's raised hand. The way she had rushed to attend to other passengers first, as if hoping Eleanor would simply stop asking. She let the moment stretch, allowing Claire to believe she had succeeded. And then, with the same quiet poise she had carried all her life, she pressed the call button. It took another 2 minutes before Claire arrived. Her polished smile strained just slightly as she looked down at Eleanor. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked, her voice still coated in false politeness. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, meeting Claire's gaze with the calm, unwavering confidence of a woman who had commanded entire rooms of skeptics and walked out victorious. "I requested a glass of champagne earlier," Eleanor said, her voice smooth but firm. "I noticed that all the other passengers have already been served." Claire blinked, her fingers tightening slightly around the small tablet she held. The hesitation was brief, but Eleanor saw it. "Oh, I must have forgotten," Claire said lightly. "I'll bring that right out." Eleanor said nothing, simply watching as Claire turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the galley. She was not angry, she was in control. And that was something people like Claire did not expect. As she waited for her drink to arrive, Eleanor reached down, adjusting the string of pearls resting at her collarbone. They had been a gift from Charles on their 25th wedding anniversary, a quiet reminder of the love they had built, the battles they had fought together. and the life they had created despite the obstacles in their way. Her strength was not in arguing, it was in knowing her worth, refusing to accept less, and ensuring that those who underestimated her learned their lesson. Claire returned moments later, setting down the long overdue glass of champagne, with a smile that no longer carried quite the same confidence. "There you go, ma'am," she said, her voice a shade quieter than before. Eleanor took the glass, her fingers wrapping around the delicate stem, but she did not drink. Instead, she simply looked at Claire for a beat longer than necessary. A moment of quiet understanding passed between them. Claire knew. She knew that Eleanor had seen through her, that she had not won this game, and that this was only the beginning. Eleanor smiled ever so slightly, just enough for Claire to see it before she turned back to her seat. Strength, she reminded herself, was not about fighting every battle. It was about knowing when to let the other side believe they had won, only to reveal at the right moment that they had never held any power at all. Eleanor Brooks sat with quiet poise in her first-class seat, her fingers resting lightly on the chilled champagne flute that had finally been placed before her. She had not yet taken a sip. Instead, she allowed herself a small moment of reflection, feeling the subtle weight of assumptions pressing against her presence in this space. It was always the same. Never outright hostility, never explicit words of rejection. Discrimination, in its most polished form, was about doubt, about questioning, about the unspoken belief that someone like her did not belong. And yet, she remained, settled, unbothered, observing. Claire Matthews, the flight attendant who had taken far too long to serve her drink, had retreated toward the front of the cabin. Though she pretended to be engaged with another passenger, Eleanor could see it, the quick glances stolen in her direction, the way Claire's posture had shifted ever so slightly, from relaxed confidence to quiet discomfort. She knew that Eleanor had seen through her, had not accepted the treatment in silence, and had made note of every moment of exclusion. But Claire was not the only one. The businessman in the aisle seat beside her, a tall, middle-aged man in a dark suit, had stolen a glance at her the moment she had first sat down. He had offered a tight smile, one that did not quite reach his eyes, before shifting his attention back to his tablet. The woman in 3 Celsiuses, a stylish blonde with a designer handbag tucked neatly beneath her seat, had watched Eleanor as well, though her expression was less subtle, more scrutinizing. It was not outright rudeness, just a lingering gaze, as if trying to place Eleanor in a context that made sense. Was she a celebrity? A politician? Someone's assistant? Anything, it seemed, except what she actually was, a first-class passenger who belonged here just as much as anyone else. It was a game she had seen play out before. People were too polite to ask directly, but their eyes did the questioning for them. Had she accidentally been assigned this seat? Had she won a lottery she wasn't supposed to? Was she someone's guest rather than someone who had earned this luxury on her own? The weight of their silent questions settled over her, but Eleanor did not shrink. She had never asked permission to exist in spaces like these, and she would not start now. The flight continued as expected. With one clear exception, Eleanor was being treated differently. It was not a mistake. It was not coincidental oversight. It was a decision. Every passenger around her was offered menus without having to ask, except her. Every passenger's drink was refilled automatically, except hers. Every interaction she had with the crew carried just enough hesitation to make it clear they were still trying to figure out if she really belonged. She had not made a scene. She had not demanded special treatment. She had simply existed in a space they were not prepared to see her in. And that, she realized, was enough to make her presence an issue. A few minutes later, Claire returned, her expression carefully arranged into polite neutrality. In her hand was a menu, finally brought to Eleanor after every other passenger had already placed their orders. "Here you go, ma'am," she said, her tone too smooth, too controlled, as if she had rehearsed this moment. Eleanor accepted the menu without a word, unfolding it slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch just long enough for Claire to feel the weight of her lateness. The options were simple but refined: filet mignon with buttered asparagus or braised short ribs with collard greens and cornbread. A quiet, knowing smile touched Eleanor's lips. The second option was intentional, a dish carefully crafted to carry cultural weight, one meant to subtly direct a certain type of passenger toward a certain type of meal. And the flight attendants, whether consciously or not, expected her to choose it. Eleanor took her time. She lifted her gaze to Claire, holding eye contact with the kind of composure that had made students sit up straighter in her classrooms years ago. "I'll have the filet," she said smoothly. Claire hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "Are you sure?" Claire asked, her voice still carrying that carefully constructed tone of professionalism, but now tinged with something else: expectation. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying Claire in return. Is there a reason I wouldn't be? She asked, her voice as calm as ever. Claire's smile thinned at the edges, and she quickly shook her head. No, not at all, she said, jotting the order down. I just wanted to make sure. Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't need to. As Claire walked away, Eleanor let her gaze drift back to the businessman beside her, who had discreetly been listening to the exchange. His eyes flickered with something unreadable before he returned to his tablet, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The woman in 3C, however, seemed oddly satisfied, as if she had just watched something unfold exactly as she had expected it to. Eleanor sighed quietly, adjusting the string of pearls resting at her collarbone. She had spent a lifetime breaking expectations, and she had no intention of stopping now. If the flight crew had assumed her place, they had done so wrongly, and by the time this flight landed, they would know exactly who they had underestimated. Eleanor Brooks remained composed in her first-class seat, her fingers gently tracing the rim of her untouched champagne flute. Though she had long mastered the art of patience, the events of this flight were beginning to follow a predictable pattern. One she had experienced before in different places with different faces, but always with the same undercurrent of exclusion. She watched as attentive service unfolded effortlessly for the other passengers, contrasting starkly with how she was being treated. Across the aisle, a well-dressed businessman barely had to glance at his flight attendant before his glass was refilled. The woman in 3C, who had watched Eleanor with curiosity earlier, received a warm towel and a quiet inquiry about her meal preferences before the flight attendants had even reached Eleanor's row. Meanwhile, Eleanor had been waiting. Not once had the crew approached her with the same gracious efficiency. Not once had she been offered so much as a refill or acknowledgement without first having to ask. And that was the difference. Some passengers were served before they had to think about what they needed. Others were made to prove they deserved the same courtesy. As the meal service began, Eleanor folded her hands neatly in her lap, watching with quiet detachment as trays were distributed row by row. The attendants moved swiftly through the cabin, their gestures polished, their smiles automatic. They placed perfectly arranged plates before each passenger, offering small pleasantries and effortless hospitality until they reached Eleanor. Claire, the flight attendant who had been avoiding her since takeoff, walked right past her seat. Eleanor's expression remained neutral, but inside, she took note. She watched as Claire placed a meal in front of every passenger around her, carefully setting down trays with practiced ease. She watched as the businessman beside her received a steaming filet mignon, the scent of buttery asparagus drifting through the air. And yet no tray was placed in front of Eleanor. She waited. Perhaps it had been a mistake. Perhaps for once she was overthinking it. But then Claire returned, not with a tray, but with an explanation. I'm sorry, she said, her voice smooth but lacking true sincerity. We've run out of filet mignon, but I can bring you something else. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. She had just watched them serve it to every single person in first class. Had she been the only one without a meal request recorded? Had they somehow overlooked just one passenger in the entire cabin? Or had they decided for her, the way people so often did? Claire continued, her tone measured but her intent clear. We do have short ribs and collard greens available, she offered, smiling just a little too much. Would that be acceptable? Eleanor understood exactly what was happening. The menu had given her two choices, and yet only one option remained for her, the dish that had been carefully curated to fit a certain assumption about what she would prefer. A dish that had been presented as a choice, but in reality was the only option they had allowed her to have. She met Claire's gaze, her expression unreadable. Are you out of filet for everyone? Eleanor asked, her voice smooth as silk. Claire hesitated for half a second too long. Oh well, she stammered slightly. It's just that we have limited quantities and… Eleanor tilted her head, slightly, studying her. I see, she said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. She held Claire's gaze just long enough to make her uncomfortable. The silence stretched. Then Claire cleared her throat. I'll check with the galley, she said quickly, turning on her heel before she could dig herself into a deeper hole. Eleanor did not watch her go. She did not need to. She simply sat, her presence alone enough to demand the respect she had been denied. Eleanor could feel it now, the subtle shift in the cabin. Passengers who had been lost in their own meals were now paying attention. A few seats ahead, a woman glanced back, brow furrowed as if suddenly noticing Eleanor's empty table. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been served promptly stole a glance in her direction, his lips pressing together as if realizing what had just happened. Even the woman in 3C who had spent the beginning of the flight scrutinizing Eleanor now looked aware. This was no longer just a quiet slight, it was becoming visible. And the moment people noticed, the power of subtle exclusion began to fade. Eleanor took a slow, even breath. She had not asked for this confrontation. But if the flight crew insisted on singling her out, then they would have to face the consequences of being seen. Claire reappeared a few minutes later, a forced smile stretched across her face. "Good news," she said, her voice overly cheerful. "It turns out we do have filet mignon left after all." She placed the tray in front of Eleanor, the meal identical to the one served to every other first-class passenger. No explanation, no apology. Just a quiet admission that Eleanor had been right. She waited for Eleanor to thank her, to accept the moment as if it had been a genuine mistake. But Eleanor said nothing. Instead, she picked up her knife and fork with slow precision, cutting into the steak with the same grace that had carried her through a lifetime of moments like this. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to prove anything. The reality of what had just happened was already plain for everyone to see. As Eleanor took her first bite, she noticed Claire hovering nearby, watching for a reaction. But Eleanor did not give her one. She simply continued eating, her expression unreadable, as if nothing had happened at all. Because that was the lesson. She did not need to prove she belonged here. She did not need to fight for respect. She had carried her dignity into this space long before anyone had tried to take it away. And she would carry it out with her when she left. Whether they realized it or not, they had already lost. Eleanor Brooks had endured covert discrimination before. It was an old familiar dance, one that was rarely outright but always felt. And today, on this flight, it was playing out yet again. She had already seen the contrast in treatment, had been served last, had been overlooked for refills, and had to insist on receiving the same meal as every other first-class passenger. She should have been enjoying her meal in peace, but she could feel the weight of silent resistance from the flight attendants. They weren't done with her yet. She saw it in their movements, in their pointed avoidance, in the way they continued to test her patience, not through direct confrontation, but through calculated passive-aggressive slights. As the meal service wound down, Eleanor watched as Claire, the flight attendant who had been at the center of her previous oversights, continued to move seamlessly through the cabin, except when it came to her. For every other passenger, Claire anticipated needs before they were spoken. She refilled wine glasses before they were empty. She collected trays efficiently, her smile warm and professional. But when Eleanor set her fork down, signaling that she was finished, Claire walked past her without so much as a glance. She had done this before, strategic neglect dressed up as routine. Eleanor waited. Across the aisle, the businessman next to her had his tray whisked away within seconds. Even the woman in 3C, who had been absorbed in a book, had her meal cleared without having to ask. And yet, Eleanor's tray remained untouched. Minutes passed. She did not press the call button. That was what they wanted, for her to ask for service, to acknowledge their behavior, to give them the satisfaction of controlling the moment. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and simply waited. She was not going to play their game. It wasn't just the delayed service. When Claire finally returned, her expression carefully arranged in feigned politeness, she reached for Eleanor's tray without making eye contact. "Everything okay with your meal?" she asked in a tone that was just a little too sweet, a little too exaggerated. Eleanor met her gaze, seeing the challenge beneath the words. Everything about the question suggested that Eleanor was the problem, as if her mere presence in first class had somehow inconvenienced the crew. Eleanor held her composure. "Yes," she said smoothly, watching as Claire's smile faltered for just a second. She had wanted a reaction, a sign of irritation, an argument, anything that would allow her to paint Eleanor as difficult. But Eleanor would not give her that satisfaction. Claire nodded quickly, then reached for the glass of champagne on Eleanor's tray, and paused. Eleanor saw it before it even happened, the split-second hesitation, the moment of deliberate decision. Claire's fingers tightened around the glass, tilted it slightly, and let a single drop of the remaining champagne spill onto the linen napkin Eleanor had placed on her lap. A fraction of a second, just enough to be an accident, but not enough to be unintentional. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Claire said, her voice dripping with artificial concern. Eleanor breathed in slowly. It was a small act, barely noticeable to anyone else. But she knew. This was a game of power, of seeing how far they could go before she pushed back. Eleanor carefully lifted the napkin, dabbing at the fabric with a deliberate slowness. Then, without looking at Claire, she set it aside and spoke. "It happens," she said mildly. Claire's expression flickered. She had expected a different response. But Eleanor Brooks had learned long ago how to hold her ground without raising her voice. As the cabin settled into post-meal service, the passengers around Eleanor returned to their routines, some reclining their seats, some ordering after-dinner drinks, Eleanor reached for the small blanket tucked beside her seat, intending to rest for the remainder of the flight. And that was when it happened. "Excuse me, ma'am," a new voice chimed in. Eleanor looked up to see Bryce, another flight attendant, standing stiffly beside her row. His polite smile was just a little too forced. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass," he said. Eleanor blinked, her grip tightening slightly around the blanket. This was not a routine request. She had flown first class countless times, and not once had she been asked to prove she belonged in her seat mid-flight. But now, after everything, after being served last, overlooked, forced to assert herself, now, they wanted proof that she belonged? She exhaled quietly, keeping her expression neutral. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice smooth, unbothered. Bryce hesitated. He had expected her to immediately comply, to scramble for her ticket, to accept this as just another procedure. But Eleanor Brooks was not going to make this easy for him. "No problem," Bryce said quickly. "It's just a new random security check we've implemented." Eleanor let the words settle in the air. A random check. Yet she was the only one being asked. She glanced toward the other passengers. Not a single one had been asked for identification. The businessman beside her had lowered his tablet slightly, watching the exchange out of the corner of his eye. The woman in 3 Celsiuses had set her book down completely. Passengers were starting to notice. And that was the last thing this crew wanted. Eleanor slowly reached for her bag, unzipping it with precise movements. She pulled out her boarding pass, not hurried, not flustered, but with the same unshaken grace she had carried through this entire flight. Then, she handed it to Bryce without a word. The flight attendant scanned it quickly, his eyes flicking over the details, his fingers tighter than necessary around the paper. And then he handed it back. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice slightly strained. Eleanor took it back with a quiet, unreadable smile. And then she dismissed him. She did not ask why. She did not challenge the lie of a random check. She did not demand an explanation. She simply returned the pass to her bag, adjusted the blanket over her lap, and leaned back into her seat. Because that was the lesson. She did not need to justify her presence. They had tried to push her out of this space, to chip away at her dignity through passive aggression and quiet hostilities. But in the end, she was still here. And the only ones who looked uncomfortable were them. Eleanor Brooks sat upright in her first-class seat, her posture unwavering as the flight continued its smooth trajectory through the sky. The lights in the cabin had dimmed slightly, creating an atmosphere of quiet relaxation, but for Eleanor, the tension had not dissipated. The subtle mistreatment she had endured thus far, being served last, ignored for refills, forced to insist on her meal, and subjected to an unnecessary ID check, had been enough to make it clear she was being targeted. And now, the next phase of their passive-aggressive assault had begun. They were withholding service. The cabin was settling into a routine. Passengers reclined in their plush seats, adjusting their blankets and ordering after-dinner drinks. The flight attendants moved seamlessly through the aisle, their polished shoes gliding across the carpet as they attended to each request with swift professional grace, for everyone except Eleanor. She observed as Bryce, the same flight attendant who had requested her ID, leaned over to take a drink order from the businessman across the aisle. "Another glass of Merlot for you, sir?" Bryce asked, his tone warm and accommodating. The man nodded, barely looking up from his tablet. Bryce poured the wine immediately, placing the glass down with practiced precision. Then he turned to the woman in 3 Celsiuses, flashing a smile. "And for you, ma'am, I'll have a chamomile tea," the woman replied. "Of course," Bryce said, nodding as he moved down the aisle. Eleanor waited. She had every intention of ordering her own drink, but no one asked her. Bryce walked past her without a glance. Claire, who had been distributing fresh blankets to the passengers in the row ahead, skipped Eleanor's seat entirely. She could feel it happening in real time, the way they moved around her, the way their bodies tensed slightly when they neared her row, the calculated decision to act as though she was not there at all. It was deliberate. They wanted her to feel invisible. Eleanor exhaled slowly, folding her hands in her lap as she watched the minutes tick by. The man beside her had his wine refreshed again. The woman in 3 Celsiuses was served her tea with a soft "enjoy" from Bryce, and the attendants continued to glide through the aisle with a level of attentiveness that was noticeably absent when it came to her. She knew this game well. It wasn't about outright refusal. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they wanted her to ask, to press the call button, to demand service so that they could frame her as a problem. Difficult, overly demanding, unworthy of first-class treatment. She refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, she let the silence stretch. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. Her patience, finally honed over a lifetime of similar encounters, remained intact. But that didn't mean she would let it go. Unnoticed, Eleanor reached for her reading glasses, sliding them onto the bridge of her nose with quiet precision. Then she picked up the in-flight menu, unfolding it carefully, and held it at an angle that made it impossible to ignore. She wasn't asking. She was reminding them that she was here. And it worked. Claire, who had been engaged in light conversation with a passenger a few rows down, stole a glance in Eleanor's direction. She noticed the menu, noticed Eleanor's composed demeanor, and perhaps most importantly, noticed the fact that several other passengers had begun to glance her way as well. With a forced smile, Claire finally approached. "Can I get you something to drink, ma'am?" she asked, her voice coated in a feigned politeness that barely concealed her frustration. Eleanor lowered the menu slightly, meeting Claire's gaze with calm, unwavering authority. "Yes," she said smoothly. "I'd like a cup of Earl Grey tea, hot, with lemon." Claire's smile tightened at the edges, but she nodded. "Of course," she said, scribbling the request on her notepad before immediately turning on her heel. No warmth, no enjoy your flight, just the bare minimum of service because she had been forced into it. Eleanor watched her go, then folded the menu with deliberate slowness, setting it aside. She had not needed to ask. She had simply made it impossible for them to pretend she did not exist. When the tea finally arrived, Claire placed it down with more force than necessary, the porcelain cup rattling slightly against the saucer. "There you go," she said, already half turning away before Eleanor could respond. But Eleanor wasn't done yet. She lifted the cup gently, testing the temperature with a careful sip, and then she smiled. "This isn't Earl Grey," she said calmly, setting the cup down. Claire froze. The passive-aggressive stunt had been obvious. Bring her the wrong drink, force her to accept it, or make her push back. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, watching the color drain from Claire's face. The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Claire's fingers tightened against her notepad. "Oh," she said, feigning surprise. "I must have grabbed the wrong one." "Must have," Eleanor murmured, holding her gaze. For a brief moment, it felt as if the entire cabin had gone still. Passengers nearby had noticed. They may not have understood the full scope of what was happening, but they saw. And now, Claire had to make a choice. Fix it, or let them all wonder why she hadn't. With a tight nod, Claire grabbed the cup and walked away briskly, disappearing toward the galley. Eleanor did not watch her go. She simply sat back, her presence unshaken, as she waited for what she had rightfully ordered. Because that was the lesson. They had tried to deny her dignity, to make her feel small, to dictate the terms of her existence in this space. But she was still here, and she wasn't going anywhere. Eleanor Brooks had faced prejudice dressed as professionalism before. She had watched people like Claire and Bryce, flight attendants who saw their job not just as service, but as a stage, a place to subtly enforce power over those they deemed unworthy. The slow service, the deliberate neglect, the passive-aggressive errors, it had all been leading to this moment. Now, they were pushing further. This wasn't just about withholding service anymore. This was about seeing how much control they could exert over her experience. Claire returned with the corrected cup of tea, setting it down before Eleanor with a forced smile and clipped tone. "Here you go," she said flatly, her eyes flicking to Bryce across the cabin. The exchange wasn't private anymore. They were coordinating, testing Eleanor in front of each other. She recognized it immediately, the way power-hungry individuals escalated mistreatment in tandem, feeding off each other's confidence, growing bolder in their actions. Eleanor lifted the cup, taking a slow sip. This time, it was correct, but the battle wasn't over. Barely 5 minutes had passed before Bryce returned, this time with a different tone. "Ma'am," he said, his expression carefully neutral. "We're going to need you to stow your personal items for the remainder of the flight." Eleanor's brow lifted slightly. "Excuse me?" Bryce gestured toward the small handbag resting beside her seat. "Policy states that all personal belongings must remain in the overhead bin or under the seat in front of you," he said. Eleanor blinked. She had flown first class countless times. She had never been asked to put her handbag anywhere except exactly where it was now. A quick glance across the cabin confirmed it. No one else had been given this instruction. The businessman beside her still had his briefcase beside him. The woman in 3C had her purse on the seat next to her. Yet Eleanor, and only Eleanor, was being told to remove hers. She met Bryce's gaze with steady patience. "Would you mind pointing out where that policy is listed?" she asked. Bryce hesitated for half a second before plastering on a mockingly patient smile. "It's part of our safety procedures, ma'am." Eleanor leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable. "I see," she said. Bryce wasn't expecting her to push back. He had assumed she would comply without question, either out of frustration or exhaustion. But Eleanor Brooks was neither frustrated nor exhausted. She was watching, she was noting every moment, and she was letting them dig their own grave. "I'd be happy to follow official procedure," she continued smoothly, her voice carrying just enough weight for the nearby passengers to hear. "But before I do, I'd like to confirm it with the flight supervisor." Bryce's polite facade faltered. "That won't be necessary." "Oh, I think it will," Eleanor interrupted, her tone as calm and unwavering as ever. She turned slightly, locking eyes with the woman in 3C, who had already set her book aside, now fully watching the exchange. The businessman across the aisle pretended to stay focused on his tablet, but his posture had shifted. The shift in power had begun. Bryce knew it, Claire knew it, and Eleanor knew they knew it. Bryce hesitated, then, realizing he had no choice, turned toward the front of the cabin. Less than a minute later, a woman in a darker navy uniform approached. Her name tag read Samantha Wells, and unlike Claire and Bryce, she carried herself with true professionalism. She took one glance at Eleanor's seat and immediately understood what was happening. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" she asked. Eleanor smiled politely. "I was just informed that I need to stow my handbag for the remainder of the flight," she said. "But I noticed that no one else has been asked to do the same." Samantha's gaze flicked to Bryce, her brows lowering slightly. Bryce shifted uncomfortably. "Well, there is no such policy," Samantha cut in smoothly. Bryce's face paled. Eleanor watched in silence as Samantha turned back to her, her professional demeanor unwavering. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, ma'am," she said. "You're welcome to keep your bag where it is." She had spoken firmly enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Bryce had just been exposed, and he knew it. Samantha gave Bryce a hard, pointed look before turning on her heel and heading back toward the galley. Eleanor did not move. She simply picked up her tea with careful grace, took a slow sip, and set it back down. She did not need to gloat. She did not need to say a word, because everyone around them had seen what had just happened. The businessman beside her cleared his throat, subtly adjusting his own briefcase. The woman in 3C, who had been quiet before, finally spoke. "Well," she murmured, her voice just loud enough for Bryce to hear. "That was interesting." Bryce's jaw tightened. Claire, who had been lingering in the background, suddenly found somewhere else to be. And Eleanor? She simply smiled to herself and leaned back into her seat, because the game had just turned in her favor. Eleanor Brooks sat quietly in her first-class seat, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. The small victory she had won against Bryce and Claire still hung in the air, a silent but undeniable shift in power. But she knew people like them didn't back down easily. When authority was challenged, especially by someone they had deemed unworthy of respect, the response was almost always the same. They would double down, and she was right. Less than 15 minutes after her quiet victory, a new challenge arrived. This time it came in the form of a different flight attendant, a tall man with sharp features and a name tag that read Kevin M. He approached Eleanor's seat with feigned professionalism, his expression carefully blank. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, "I need to speak with you regarding your seat assignment." Eleanor remained still. "My seat assignment?" she repeated, her voice polite but firm. Kevin nodded, glancing at the tablet in his hand. "It seems there was an error when your ticket was processed at check-in," he said. "You were mistakenly assigned a first-class seat when your original booking was actually for economy." The words settled between them, cold and calculated. Eleanor exhaled slowly. There it was. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't a clerical mistake. This was an attempt to remove her from the space they didn't believe she belonged in. And they were playing their final card, using airline authority to do it. She glanced around the cabin, noting the way Bryce and Claire had positioned themselves nearby, watching from a short distance. They were waiting to see what she would do. Eleanor could almost hear their unspoken challenge. Will she fight back? Will she make a scene? Will she give us the excuse we need to remove her entirely? But she had no intention of giving them what they wanted. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, keeping her voice even. "That's interesting," she mused, glancing at the tablet in Kevin's hand. "Because I checked in with this seat, received my boarding pass, and had no issues until now." Kevin didn't flinch. "These things happen," he said smoothly, his expression unchanging. "Mistakes occur in the system sometimes, and unfortunately we have to correct them when they do." Eleanor let the moment stretch. She could feel the weight of the nearby passengers' eyes, sensing that some had caught onto the tension. She had two options: comply, move to economy quietly, allow them to win, and endure the humiliation, expose them, make them explain themselves loud enough for the rest of the cabin to hear. She chose the latter. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the passengers in the surrounding seats could hear. "I see," she said, a soft note of understanding in her tone. "And tell me, how often does this happen? Mistakenly placing a first-class passenger in economy, or is it more common the other way around?" Kevin's jaw tightened just slightly. Bryce, still standing a few feet away, shifted uneasily. Eleanor pressed on. "You'll forgive me," she continued, her voice light but steady. "But I find it odd that this mistake has only been discovered now, after I was repeatedly denied service, forced to confirm my ID mid-flight, and subjected to inconsistent policy enforcement." She let that sit for a moment before finishing, her voice unwavering, "And now, coincidentally, I'm being asked to move." The silence that followed was deafening. The businessman beside her glanced up from his tablet. The woman in 3 Celsiuses, the same one who had observed the handbag incident, folded her arms, now fully engaged. Eleanor had made them an audience, and Kevin knew it. For the first time, hesitation flickered across his face. What had been a simple power play was now a public confrontation, and that was not what they had planned. Kevin glanced back at Bryce and Claire, who both avoided his gaze. They had expected Eleanor to accept this quietly, to get up and move with humiliated compliance. They had underestimated her. Kevin cleared his throat, straightening his posture. "Well, ma'am," he said, grasping for control. "If you'd like, I can check with the gate agent's records and confirm the original booking." Eleanor smiled. There it was, a way out, a subtle retreat without having to admit wrongdoing. She leaned back again, her posture effortlessly composed. "That would be wonderful," she said smoothly. Kevin nodded stiffly. "I'll be back shortly." And with that, he turned on his heel and walked away, moving toward the front of the cabin with far more urgency than when he had arrived. The tension did not immediately fade. Bryce and Claire lingered, as if still debating whether they should try one last move. But the damage had been done. The businessman across the aisle raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. The woman in 3 Celsiuses shook her head slightly, exhaling. And Eleanor? She simply picked up her tea, took a slow sip, and set it back down. Because now everyone knew the truth. She wasn't being asked to move because of a mistake. She was being asked to move because they had tried every other tactic and failed. And in trying to correct a mistake that never existed, they had made the biggest one of all. Eleanor Brooks remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. Her expression was poised, unreadable. But beneath her calm exterior, she could feel the shift in the air. The flight attendants had tried everything to make her uncomfortable, denied her service, subtly humiliated her, and even attempted to remove her from her first-class seat under the guise of a clerical error. But now other people were noticing. She had seen it in their faces, in the way their conversations quieted whenever another flight attendant approached her. In the subtle glances exchanged between passengers who had witnessed enough to know something wasn't right. And that, Eleanor knew, was more powerful than anything she could say herself. Across the aisle, the businessman in 2A, who had spent the majority of the flight engrossed in his tablet, now looked up fully. He hadn't been paying close attention before, but after watching Eleanor be asked to move, only for the request to suddenly be retracted, his focus had shifted. He wasn't alone. The woman in 3C, who had first noticed the handbag incident, adjusted in her seat. She exchanged a quiet look with the older woman beside her before leaning in, whispering, "Did you see that?" The older woman nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That was no mistake," she murmured. "They're trying to get rid of her." Further down the row, a young couple who had only half registered the tension before now sat up a little straighter. The man leaned toward his wife. "This has been going on the whole flight," he muttered under his breath. "I didn't think much of it at first, but—" He trailed off, watching as Bryce and Claire stood near the galley, speaking in hushed voices. Their plan hadn't worked, and now it was clear to more than just Eleanor. Passengers in first class weren't the only ones picking up on the shift. Just beyond the dividing curtain, a few travelers seated in economy's first row had also noticed the tension. A young woman, who had been watching the way flight attendants ignored Eleanor earlier, pulled out her phone, subtly typing. "She paid for first class, but they're treating her like she doesn't belong," she texted her friend. "It's uncomfortable to watch." Beside her, a middle-aged man sighed and shook his head. "I flew this airline last month," he muttered to no one in particular, "and I didn't see anyone get treated like this." The murmurs were spreading. Eleanor, still seated with perfect composure, could feel it. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to turn to them and explain, because people were starting to put the pieces together themselves. Bryce and Claire were starting to realize it too. They had expected silence. They had counted on compliance. But now, instead of a single black woman they could dismiss without consequences, they were dealing with a growing audience of passengers who weren't blind to what was happening. Bryce turned toward Claire, lowering his voice. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. Claire nodded stiffly, her jaw clenched. We should have just left it alone, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Now they're all watching. Bryce exhaled sharply, his hands tightening into fists. This is going to be a problem. Eleanor remained still, watching as passengers continued to whisper among themselves. And then, something happened that changed everything. It was a small action, but one that sent a very clear message. The businessman in 2A, who had barely acknowledged the situation before, suddenly pressed his call button. A few seats down, the woman in 3C did the same. Then, one by one, more lights lit up across the first-class cabin. Call buttons activated in quiet unison. No one spoke, no one looked at Eleanor. But the message was undeniable. The passengers were making it clear, we see what's happening, and we're not ignoring it. When Bryce and Claire saw the lights illuminating across the cabin, their faces visibly paled. They had lost control of the narrative. This wasn't just Eleanor Brooks pushing back anymore. This was half of first class silently rebelling. For the first time since the flight took off, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. They had wanted her to feel alone. Instead, they had made her impossible to ignore. At the front of the plane, Kevin, the flight attendant who had been sent to execute their false correction, stood with the lead flight supervisor, Samantha Wells. Samantha had already been alerted to the earlier incident with Eleanor's handbag. Now, she was being updated on the growing tension in first class. She frowned, watching as Bryce and Claire hurriedly whispered to each other. She had seen this before, an issue that had been mishandled so badly that passengers were now getting involved. This was no longer just a service complaint. This was a full-blown escalation, and the pilot needed to be informed. Samantha picked up the in-flight phone, dialing the cockpit. "Captain," she said evenly, "we might have a situation developing in first class." Eleanor took another slow sip of her tea, her movements calm and deliberate. She wasn't the one raising her voice. She wasn't the one making a scene. She had simply held her ground. And in doing so, she had forced the flight crew into a losing battle. Because now, no matter what happened next, one thing was absolutely certain. They had been exposed. And soon, someone with real authority would be coming to handle it. Eleanor Brooks sat with an air of calm, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. Around her, the tension in the cabin thickened, but she remained unshaken. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued. She had simply held her ground. And now, the pressure was on them. Across the aisle, flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, their feigned professionalism starting to crack. The passengers, once detached from the situation, were now fully aware, and their quiet rebellion was growing. The call buttons still glowed overhead, each one a silent but undeniable act of solidarity. No one spoke, but the message was loud. "We see what you're doing, and we don't approve." Bryce stood stiffly near the galley, his hands clenched at his sides. He had expected Eleanor to push back loudly, to react in a way that could be used against her. Instead, she had remained poised. Instead, she had let their own actions expose them. Claire, standing beside him, whispered urgently, "We have to do something." Bryce didn't respond. For the first time since the flight began, he had no idea what to do. Every move they made had only backfired. Every attempt to silence Eleanor had only drawn more attention. Now, with passengers watching, they were trapped. Eleanor took a slow breath, surveying the cabin. She didn't need to meet anyone's gaze directly. She could feel their support. The businessman in 2A sat with his arms crossed, watching the flight attendants carefully. The woman in 3C tapped her fingers against the tray table, her expression unreadable but firm. Further back, a younger passenger subtly recorded the interaction on her phone, capturing the unspoken tension in the air. They were waiting, not for Eleanor to speak, but for the crew to act, and Bryce knew it. Kevin, the senior flight attendant, stepped forward with forced authority, his voice carefully measured. "Ma'am," he addressed Eleanor, his tone lighter than before, as if trying to smooth over the situation. "Is there anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable?" It was a clear attempt to neutralize the situation, to regain control without admitting fault. Eleanor knew this game. This was damage control. This was a way to shift the narrative, to make it seem as if she had simply been difficult and they were doing their best to accommodate her. She gave Kevin a small, polite smile. "I only ever expected the same courtesy given to every other passenger," she replied, her voice smooth, deliberate. The simple statement carried a weight that filled the cabin. Kevin hesitated. Bryce stiffened. Claire swallowed hard, because everyone knew that courtesy had not been given. At the front of the plane, the curtain separating first class from the cockpit suddenly shifted. Samantha Wells, the lead flight supervisor, stepped into the cabin. She had been briefed on the situation. She had seen the concerned looks from passengers, and she had just gotten off the phone with the captain. The moment she stepped forward, the energy shifted. Bryce and Claire straightened immediately, their professional masks snapping back into place. Kevin took a small step back, and Eleanor, she simply watched, because she knew what was coming next. Samantha took in the scene. She noted the tense expressions of her flight attendants, the passengers watching with quiet expectation. Eleanor, composed and untouched by the chaos around her. Finally, her gaze settled on Bryce. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone sharp but professional. Bryce opened his mouth but hesitated. What could he say? That they had harassed a first-class passenger for hours? That they had attempted to remove her under false pretenses? That their behavior had become so obvious even the passengers had turned against them? He swallowed, trying to mask his unease. "There was a misunderstanding," he said carefully. Samantha's eyebrows lifted. "A misunderstanding," she repeated. Her eyes flicked to Eleanor. "Ms. Brooks, do you feel you've been treated fairly on this flight?" Silence. Then Eleanor, ever graceful, gave a small nod. "I believe the other passengers can answer that," she said simply. The moment hung in the air. Then a voice from behind them. "She's right," the businessman in 2A spoke, his voice firm. "We've all seen it. I saw how they ignored her," the woman in 3 Celsiuses added. "They skipped her meal service," another passenger muttered. The floodgates had opened. Passengers, one by one, began speaking up, not in anger, not in shouting, but in steady, undeniable truth. And the more they spoke, the more Bryce and Claire realized they had already lost. Samantha's expression hardened as she took in the weight of the complaints. She exhaled slowly, turning back to Bryce, Claire, and Kevin. "We will be discussing this after the flight," she said, her voice clipped. "Expect to be debriefed upon landing." That was not a request. It was a warning. Kevin nodded stiffly. Claire's face was pale. Bryce didn't say a word, because they had no defense left. With the issue officially being addressed, the tension in the cabin began to ease. Passengers leaned back in their seats. The whispers died down. Eleanor, however, remained unchanged. She had never needed to raise her voice. She had never needed to fight back with anger. She had simply let the truth be seen. And now, she had won, not through confrontation, but through quiet, undeniable strength. As she took a final sip of her tea, she felt the calm of certainty settle over her. This wasn't just about a flight. This was about dignity, and she had never lost hers. The cabin felt different now. The hum of the engines was the same, the soft rustling of newspapers and the occasional chime of the intercom unchanged. And yet, everything had shifted. Eleanor Brooks sat with an air of quiet confidence. Around her, passengers had grown keenly aware of what had been happening. No longer just bystanders, they had become witnesses. The flight attendants, once so sure of their control, now seemed uncertain. Their movements were stiffer, their expressions carefully measured. They were exposed, and Eleanor knew the moment had come. She reached into her bag with deliberate ease, pulling out a simple leather case. The gold lettering on the ID inside caught the dim overhead light as she slowly unfolded it and placed it on her tray table. She did not speak. She did not need to. The name Eleanor Brooks sat boldly beneath an official title, board member, Federal Aviation Commission. The reaction was instant. Bryce, the lead flight attendant, froze mid-step. His gaze locked onto the ID, the blood draining from his face as the weight of his actions settled in. Claire, standing just behind him, let out a sharp breath. Her hand gripped the edge of a nearby seat as though steadying herself. Passengers sitting nearby leaned in slightly, eyes widening as they took in the ID. A murmur rippled through the cabin. "She works for the FAA?" someone whispered. "Oh, they are in trouble," another muttered. Bryce snapped out of his shock, his professional mask slipping as he tried desperately to regain control. "Ms. Brooks," he began, his voice a touch too high, too eager to smooth things over. "If there's been any miscommunication," Eleanor lifted a single brow. "A miscommunication?" she repeated, her voice calm, but carrying the full weight of her authority. Bryce swallowed hard. "We, of course, value all our first-class passengers," he stammered, his tone shifting from authority to desperation. Eleanor exhaled slowly and finally met his gaze. "Do you?" she asked simply. And just like that, Bryce had nothing left to say. A tense, expectant silence filled the first-class cabin. No one moved. No one spoke. Claire shifted uncomfortably. She had been so sure that Eleanor was just another passenger, someone they could dismiss, someone who wouldn't be believed. But now she was someone who could hold them accountable. Eleanor tapped a manicured nail, lightly against her ID. This airline operates under FAA regulations, she said smoothly, and this flight is currently violating multiple passenger rights. Bryce stiffened. Passengers leaned in closer. Eleanor continued, her tone even and unshaken. Let's review, she said. I was subjected to deliberate neglect. Passengers nodded in agreement. I was moved from my assigned first-class seat under false pretenses. A murmur of disapproval spread through the cabin. I was repeatedly denied the same service given to every other first-class passenger. The businessman in 2A cleared his throat. We all saw it. Claire's fingers twitched at her sides, her breath coming faster. Eleanor turned her gaze directly to her. You called it a miscommunication, she said. Tell me, Miss Claire, was it truly a mistake? Claire said nothing. Her silence spoke louder than any confession. A shift near the front of the plane caught Eleanor's attention. Samantha Wells, the flight supervisor, had just stepped in from the galley, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. She had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit ever since the passengers started speaking up. Now she had seen enough. Miss Brooks, she said, her voice laced with professionalism, I sincerely apologize for any mistreatment you've experienced on this flight. Bryce flinched. Eleanor remained composed. I trust you're already filing an incident report, she asked coolly. Samantha nodded immediately. I'll personally ensure this matter is escalated, she said. And upon landing, our corporate team will be waiting to address this situation directly. Bryce's face turned ghostly pale. Passengers exchanged knowing glances. The consequences were coming. Eleanor picked up her ID, slipping it back into her bag with practiced ease. With one simple action, she had taken all the power away from the flight attendants who had sought to humiliate her. She had done what they never expected. She had held them accountable. And now, they would face the full weight of their own actions. The flight continued in absolute silence. No more dismissive glances, no more withheld service, no more microaggressions disguised as politeness. Just quiet. Bryce, Claire, and Kevin kept their distance. Passengers, still watching Eleanor with admiration, exchanged subtle nods of respect. She had won, not with anger, not with retaliation, but with truth. And that truth had been more powerful than anything they had thrown at her. As the plane descended toward its destination, Eleanor gazed out the window, at peace, because she knew this was not the end. When the plane landed, when they reached the terminal, when the corporate team arrived, that was when the real consequences would begin. And Eleanor, she would walk off this plane the same way she had walked onto it, with grace, dignity, and the quiet assurance that she had never, not for 1 second, been anything less than exactly where she belonged. A heavy silence lingered in the first-class cabin. The weight of Eleanor Brooks's revelation still hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Passengers who had once been passive observers were now sitting up straighter, shifting in their seats, exchanging glances. They had all witnessed what had happened. Some had ignored it. Others had been uncomfortable but unwilling to speak. But now, everything had changed. A woman in her early 50s, dressed in a tailored gray blazer, adjusted the strap of her leather tote and cleared her throat. I was sitting in 3 billions, she began, her voice steady but laced with conviction. All eyes turned to her. I watched what happened to Miss Brooks, she continued, and I remember thinking at the time that something about it felt off. Her gaze flickered toward Bryce, the lead flight attendant. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. It wasn't handled like a simple seating mistake, the woman said firmly. It felt like a decision. A few heads nodded in agreement. A younger man, likely in his early 30s, with a backpack slung over one shoulder, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced between Eleanor and the flight crew, his face tense with realization. I didn't want to assume the worst when I saw it happening, he admitted. I told myself maybe I was just misinterpreting things. He shook his head. But then I noticed how Miss Brooks was treated for the rest of the flight. The way she was ignored when she asked for her meal. The way her champagne was warm while ours were served cold. The way she was talked down to. He exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the armrest. I should have said something earlier. Eleanor turned toward him, her expression calm but kind. It's never too late to speak the truth, she said softly. His eyes flickered with gratitude. A third passenger, a middle-aged woman seated near the front of economy, raised her hand slightly before speaking. I saw when she was brought back, she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. I remember thinking it didn't make sense. She carried herself like someone who belonged up there. And when I heard the way she was spoken to, her lips pressed into a thin line. It made it even harder to ignore. She turned toward Claire, one of the flight attendants who had played a key role in the mistreatment. Claire shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twitching at her sides. Another voice rose from the back of first class. I was next to her when she asked for a menu, an older gentleman in a navy blue suit said. I heard how polite she was, how patient she was, and I saw how long it took for her to finally get served. His gaze hardened. There's no excuse for that. Bryce stiffened, his composure cracking just slightly. A man in 1A, who had spent most of the flight scrolling through his phone, lowered his voice but didn't hold back. "This whole flight, I've watched how you all treated Miss Brooks," he said, directing his words at the crew. "I didn't say anything, because I thought maybe there was something I didn't know, some logical reason for all of it." He shook his head. But there wasn't. He turned his gaze toward Samantha, the flight supervisor, who had just entered the cabin. "So, what's going to be done about this?" The flight attendants stood frozen, their usual confidence shattered. Claire's lips parted slightly, as if scrambling for an excuse, but nothing came. Bryce's hands twitched at his sides, his breath coming faster. They had assumed that Eleanor was alone in this, that no one would speak, that no one would care. But now the cabin had turned against them. Passengers who had once ignored the subtle acts of discrimination were now angry, vocal, and demanding answers. Samantha, the flight supervisor, straightened her blazer, her expression unreadable, but Eleanor could see the quiet understanding in her eyes. She had realized, too late, the depth of the mistake that had been made. The plane continued its descent, but the tension in the air remained thick. The power had shifted. No longer were Eleanor's mistreatment and quiet exclusion something to be swept under the rug. Now it was out in the open. Undeniable, unforgivable. Eleanor inhaled deeply, exhaling slowly as she watched the crew crumble under the weight of their own actions. They had tried to make her small, they had tried to erase her, but now they stood on the verge of facing the consequences they never expected. As the plane touched down, passengers sat up straighter, knowing the storm was far from over. Eleanor remained poised, knowing that the next few moments would determine everything. Would the airline take true responsibility, or would this just be another incident brushed aside? Either way, she would be ready. She always had been, and as the seatbelt sign switched off, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The moment the plane touched down, a tense anticipation filled the air. The usual hum of passengers unbuckling their seatbelts, stretching after the long flight, and reaching for their overhead bags felt muted, overshadowed by the heavy energy of consequence that now loomed over the cabin. For Rebecca, it felt as if the walls were closing in. She had spent the entire flight believing she was in control, that she had successfully put Eleanor Brooks in her place, that her carefully calculated slights, her quiet acts of exclusion had gone unnoticed. But now everything had changed. Passengers who had been silent before were now speaking. Eyes that had ignored Eleanor's mistreatment were now watching closely. Rebecca's confidence, once impenetrable, now wavered. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, Eleanor Brooks sat calmly in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her posture unshaken. She had been patient all her life. She had endured quiet battles like this countless times before, and she had already won this one. Rebecca, on the other hand, felt the weight of something she had never experienced before: accountability. Her fingers clenched around the service manual she held, her grip tight, almost desperate. She had thought this would end with Eleanor leaving the plane, quietly accepting her place, but now she wasn't so sure. As the doors of the aircraft finally opened and passengers began filing out, Rebecca took a deep breath. She forced a practiced smile onto her face, ready to put this all behind her. But then she saw him, standing just past the gate, his presence impossible to ignore. Tall, composed, dressed in a navy blue suit that spoke of authority without a single word. His polished shoes planted firmly, his posture exuding control in a way that instantly made her stomach drop. Eleanor walked toward him without hesitation, and then the man did something Rebecca never expected. He smiled at Eleanor, not out of politeness but out of deep, unmistakable familiarity. Then he spoke. "Mom." The single word sent a shockwave through Rebecca's chest. She felt her breath catch, her vision swim. Mom? Her mom? No. No. Her mind raced, her stomach twisting as she felt the ground beneath her feet suddenly feel unstable, because now she knew exactly who this man was, and the weight of her mistake came crashing down all at once. Devin Brooks, CEO of this airline, not just any executive, the executive. The man who had built a name for himself in the industry. The man who had turned the company into one of the most respected airlines in the country. And she had spent the entire flight humiliating his mother. Rebecca's throat went dry. She had done everything in her power to make Eleanor feel small, to make her feel less than, to remind her that she didn't belong in first class. But now, she realized Eleanor Brooks belonged more than anyone else on that flight. And the power Rebecca thought she had held, it had just slipped from her grasp entirely. Rebecca's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she struggled to process what was happening. Devin turned his attention from his mother to her, his eyes calm but unyielding. And in that moment, Rebecca knew. She knew there was no escape from this. She had spent the entire flight underestimating the wrong woman. And now, there would be consequences. Passengers who had witnessed the entire ordeal were pausing as they exited the aircraft, their curiosity growing as they saw the confrontation unfold. Some had suspected something would happen, but no one had expected this. Rebecca swallowed hard, her palms sweaty, her mind racing for an explanation, an excuse, anything that could pull her out of the mess she had created. But there was nothing. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. Devin's voice was calm, steady, professional, but with an edge of finality that made Rebecca's stomach twist. "I trust you understand the severity of what happened on this flight," he said. Rebecca couldn't breathe. There was nothing she could say that would change what had happened, because it wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was a failure of service, a failure of leadership, and most of all, a failure of basic human decency. Passengers lingered nearby, their quiet murmurs filling the air. Some took out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. Rebecca felt her knees weaken. This wasn't just between her and Devin anymore. This was about to become something bigger, something she couldn't hide from. Her hands shook, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. And then, the final blow landed. "Effective immediately, you are placed on suspension pending a full investigation," Devin stated. Rebecca felt her chest tighten, her ears ring. She had gone from feeling invincible to being powerless in a matter of seconds. Passengers whispered in shock, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Claire, one of the other flight attendants, stepped back, her expression a mix of fear and realization. Rebecca had assumed her power would protect her, but now she had been reduced to nothing more than a disgraced employee standing in the terminal with no defense left to give. Eleanor, still poised, still composed, didn't say a single word. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than anything Rebecca could ever say. Rebecca had tried to make Eleanor feel small, but in the end, it was Rebecca who had been put in her place. And as Devin turned toward his mother, gently guiding her toward the exit, Rebecca finally understood. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was the moment that ended everything for her. Because when the CEO's mother speaks, the world listens. Rebecca Stone had spent her career believing she was untouchable. For years, she had perfected the art of subtle discrimination, wielding her authority in ways that were just quiet enough to avoid scrutiny, but loud enough to send a message. She had never once faced real consequences for her actions until today. Standing in the middle of the terminal, her breath shallow, Rebecca struggled to process the weight of what had just happened. Her suspension had been announced in front of passengers and crew. Her power, once absolute, had been stripped away in an instant. And now, she was forced to answer for what she had done. The murmurs of the watching passengers grew louder. The quiet exchange that had started between Devin Brooks and Rebecca had now captured the attention of nearly everyone around them. Some had witnessed the injustice firsthand on the flight. Others had only seen the aftermath but could sense the weight of the moment. Phones were raised discreetly, capturing footage of the CEO disciplining a flight attendant in real time. Rebecca knew this moment would soon spread beyond these walls, and that terrified her. Devin Brooks stood firm, his hands in his pockets, his face calm but unyielding. He wasn't a man prone to anger. He didn't need to shout to make his presence known. His authority was felt in the way he carried himself, in the measured weight of his words. "Rebecca," he said, his voice level, "you failed in your duty today." Rebecca flinched, failed. The words sliced through her more than she wanted to admit. Devin continued. "You weren't just rude," he said, his tone even. "You deliberately targeted a passenger. You made her feel unwelcome. You withheld service. You publicly humiliated her." He let the words settle before delivering the final blow. "And you did all of this," he said, "to my mother." Gasps rippled through the surrounding crowd. Passengers who hadn't yet connected the dots suddenly realized the full gravity of the situation. The woman Rebecca had spent the entire flight trying to push out of first class was the CEO's mother. And now, Rebecca felt the weight of her mistake crush her. I didn't know," Rebecca stammered, her voice trembling. Devin's expression remained unreadable. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said smoothly. "You thought she was just another elderly black woman, someone you could dismiss, someone you could degrade without consequence." Rebecca tried to speak, but Devin wasn't finished. "This isn't just about my mother," he continued. "How many other passengers have you treated this way?" Rebecca's face drained of color. She wanted to deny it, but she couldn't, because she knew this wasn't the first time, and Devin knew it too. Devon's gaze shifted toward the other flight attendants. Some stood stiffly, their expressions guilty as they realized they too had played a part in this. They had seen what Rebecca had done, and they had let it happen. There would be consequences for them too. This isn't just about one person, Devon said, his eyes scanning the crew. Everyone who stood by and did nothing, you are just as responsible. A few of the flight attendants visibly swallowed. One, Sarah, a younger attendant who had kept her head down the entire flight, finally spoke up. I didn't know what to do, she admitted quietly, her voice shaky. I should have said something, but... Her voice faltered. Devon sighed, but his tone was measured. Silence, he said, is just as damaging as the act itself. Sarah's eyes fell to the floor. And Rebecca? She could feel her own breath turn shallow. The weight of the moment, the inescapability of her actions, was crushing her. Devon turned slightly, addressing one of his assistants standing nearby. Prepare an official statement, he instructed. We will conduct a full investigation into the culture of discrimination within our airline. Rebecca's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the entire company facing scrutiny. Her actions had set off a chain reaction, one that she couldn't stop. Rebecca took a step back, her hands shaking. She had lost everything in a single flight. Her position, her reputation, her power. She had spent the entire day making Eleanor Brooks feel small. And now? She was the one who had been reduced to nothing. Passengers continued to watch, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and disbelief, because today justice had been delivered. Through it all, Eleanor Brooks had remained silent. She had let the truth speak for itself, but as she turned to leave, she paused. She looked at Rebecca one last time, and then she spoke. I hope, Eleanor said softly, that you learn from this. Her voice was gentle, not vengeful, not cruel, but disappointingly calm. Then, with quiet dignity, she turned away, walking alongside her son, leaving Rebecca behind, leaving her to face the weight of her own choices. The story of Eleanor Brooks's mistreatment at the hands of flight attendant Rebecca Stone spread faster than anyone could have imagined. By the time Eleanor and her son, Devon Brooks, left the airport, the internet was already on fire. Someone on the flight had captured the entire ordeal. Rebecca's dismissive attitude, the public humiliation of moving Eleanor to economy, and Devon's measured but devastating response when he revealed that Eleanor was his mother. The footage had been uploaded to social media within minutes, and by the time the plane had landed, the story had already gone viral. Comments flooded in. This is disgusting. How does this still happen in 2025? The way she treated Eleanor like she was nothing. I hope she never works again. She had no idea who she was messing with. Karma came quick. Imagine finding out you lost your job over first-class peanuts and champagne. Respect shouldn't be based on who you think someone is. She should have treated Eleanor right from the start. It didn't take long before mainstream media picked up the story. News outlets ran headlines like, Airline flight attendant humiliates elderly black woman. Unaware she's the CEO's mother, viral video exposes systemic racism in first-class travel. Justice served? Airline suspends flight attendant after public outcry. Rebecca Stone's face was everywhere. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was the face of a larger conversation about racial discrimination in air travel. And people were demanding accountability. At airline headquarters, executives were panicking. They had seen public relations disasters before, but nothing like this. This was personal. This was the CEO's mother. And worse, the entire world was watching. Devon Brooks had anticipated this reaction. He knew the company's reputation was now at stake. But unlike the executives scrambling to do damage control, he wasn't looking to cover it up. He was going to fix it. That evening, Devon addressed the public in a video message. He didn't hide behind corporate jargon. He didn't issue a weak apology. He spoke with directness and conviction. The incident that occurred on Flight 572 was not just a personal attack on my mother. It was a reflection of a systemic issue in the airline industry. No passenger should ever feel unwelcome because of their age, their race, or any other factor. Rebecca Stone has been placed on indefinite suspension pending a full investigation. However, the problem is bigger than one employee. Effective immediately, our airline will conduct a full review of our training programs and our company culture. We will not tolerate discrimination in any form. This is not just about correcting what happened to my mother. It's about making sure it never happens to anyone again. The video went viral instantly. People respected Devon's honesty. They saw a CEO taking real action, not just trying to save face. And for the first time in a long time, an airline scandal wasn't just swept under the rug. While the airline was working on rebuilding its reputation, Rebecca was watching her life crumble. She had avoided reporters all day, but eventually, she sat down for an interview on live television. Rebecca looked tired, pale, and defensive. "I wasn't racist. I was just following airline policy." This is being blown out of proportion. "I didn't even know she was the CEO's mother." But her excuses didn't land. Viewers weren't buying it. Because whether Eleanor was the CEO's mother or not, Rebecca's behavior had been unacceptable, and she had no real defense. The public wasn't interested in excuses. They wanted change. Within days, the airline announced major changes: mandatory bias training for all employees, a whistleblower program to report discrimination, secret passengers program where undercover customers evaluate first-class service, better oversight of flight attendant behavior. And the biggest change, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Any employee found treating passengers unfairly would face immediate termination. The public applauded the changes, but they weren't ready to forgive just yet. Throughout the controversy, Eleanor remained quiet. She didn't do interviews. She didn't seek revenge. She simply let the truth speak for itself. But when reporters finally caught up with her, she offered one short statement: "I didn't need special treatment. I only wanted to be treated with dignity, just like every passenger deserves." Her grace and wisdom resonated with millions. Because Eleanor never fought for revenge, she fought for justice. And in the end, that's exactly what she got. Rebecca lost her career, her reputation, and her future. But the lesson wasn't just for her, it was for everyone. It was a reminder that how you treat people matters, not just when they have power, but even when you assume they don't. And while the airline industry still had a long way to go, one thing was clear: change had begun. And it all started with one woman who refused to be silent. Rebecca Stone had never faced consequences before. She had spent years navigating the airline industry with confidence and control, moving through first-class cabins as if she were the gatekeeper of who belonged and who didn't. And for most of her career, no one had challenged her. Passengers had grumbled, but they never spoke up. Her colleagues had witnessed her passive-aggressive treatment of certain travelers, but they never intervened. It was the silent power of subtle discrimination, never overt, never loud enough to be called out directly. But this time, she had made a mistake, a career-ending mistake. As Rebecca stood in the airport terminal, staring at Devin Brooks, the airline CEO, standing beside his mother, the full weight of her miscalculation hit her like a ton of bricks. Her heart pounded as her mind raced for an explanation, any excuse that could make this nightmare go away. But there wasn't one. Devin's words had been clear and final. Effective immediately, you are placed on suspension pending a full investigation into your actions on this flight. Rebecca's knees nearly buckled beneath her. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was the end of everything she had worked for. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, to explain. But what could she say? She had spent the entire flight humiliating a woman she assumed had no power. She had openly disregarded her dignity. She had mocked her, dismissed her, and moved her to economy like she was nothing. And now, the entire world knew. Within hours, the airline was flooded with complaints. Passengers, both on her flight and those who had never met her, were calling for her immediate termination. Fire her now. She's a disgrace to the airline industry. This is why people don't trust airlines. Do better. By morning, her name was trending on social media. The video footage of her escorting Eleanor Brooks out of first class was replayed on every major news network. Journalists dug into her work history. Anonymous airline employees started coming forward, revealing that Rebecca had a long track record of questionable behavior. Former passengers began sharing their own stories of being subtly mistreated by her. "She did the same thing to me last year. I thought I was imagining it." Her once flawless career was now in ruins. While Rebecca was spiraling, Devon Brooks remained calm and focused. He knew the public was watching. He knew the airline's reputation was at stake. But most importantly, he knew this wasn't just about his mother. The issue isn't just Rebecca Stone. It's the culture that allows behavior like hers to go unchecked. He met with the board of directors and made his decision. Rebecca would not just be suspended, she would be fired, permanently. The airline's official statement was brutal in its clarity. "After a thorough review, we have determined that Rebecca Stone's actions were in direct violation of our commitment to inclusivity and respect for all passengers. As of today, she is no longer employed with this airline. Furthermore, we are implementing company-wide changes to ensure that discrimination, subtle or otherwise, has no place in our organization. We apologize to Eleanor Brooks and to every passenger who has ever felt unwelcome on one of our flights." The public applauded the move, but for Rebecca, it was the final blow. Rebecca tried one last time to save her career. She hired a lawyer. She demanded a private meeting with the airline. She threatened a lawsuit, claiming she had been unfairly targeted and that Devin was using his power for personal revenge. But the airline stood firm. "You weren't fired because of who Eleanor Brooks is," Devin told her in a final meeting. "You were fired because of what you did." She had no defense. She had no case. She had nowhere to go. Her final act of desperation was an interview with a news station where she tried to defend herself. "This is cancel culture. I was just following policy. I didn't do anything wrong. They just needed a scapegoat." But the public didn't buy it. She had been caught red-handed on video, humiliating an elderly woman who deserved respect. No excuse could erase that. And just like that, Rebecca disappeared from the public eye. She lost her job, her reputation, and any hope of working in the airline industry again. Rebecca had spent years believing she had power over passengers. She had assumed she could treat people however she wanted, as long as she kept it quiet. But this time, she underestimated the wrong person. Eleanor Brooks didn't fight back with rage. She didn't raise her voice. She simply let the truth reveal itself. And in the end, that was far more powerful than anything Rebecca could have expected. Because when you abuse power, eventually it turns against you. The aftermath of Rebecca Stone's downfall was swift and unforgiving. The airline made headlines for weeks, not just for the incident itself, but for how they responded. The video footage, the passenger testimonials, and the public outrage had forced a reckoning, not just for one flight attendant, but for an entire industry. For too long, subtle discrimination had gone unnoticed. For too long, passengers like Eleanor Brooks had been treated as if they didn't belong. But this time, the world had paid attention, and the impact of that moment wasn't going away anytime soon. Devin Brooks, the airline CEO, knew this was a defining moment for the company. If they simply fired Rebecca and moved on, it would be seen as damage control, not real change. So instead, he took action. Mandatory training for all flight attendants, not just on customer service, but on implicit bias and equitable treatment. An anonymous reporting system so passengers and employees alike could report discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. Surprise audits on flights, ensuring that every passenger in first class received the same level of service, regardless of race, gender, or background. Public transparency, releasing an annual report on discrimination complaints and how they were handled. This wasn't just about fixing one mistake. This was about ensuring it didn't happen again. And the public? They noticed. The airline's swift response turned criticism into cautious approval. This is how companies should respond. They actually took responsibility, respect. Let's hope these changes last. But one person, more than anyone else, knew the real impact of that flight. Eleanor Brooks. A few months later, Eleanor booked another first-class ticket. Not out of defiance, not out of some need to prove a point, but because she had always belonged there, and she wasn't about to let one bad experience take that away. As she approached the check-in counter, a young flight attendant greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning, ma'am," she said, scanning Eleanor's boarding pass. "Welcome aboard." No hesitation, no second glance, no assumption that she was in the wrong place. Eleanor nodded politely, stepping toward the gate, feeling something subtle but unmistakable, a shift in the air. It wasn't grand or dramatic. No one was making an announcement about how things had changed. But it was there, in the small details, in the way the crew moved through the cabin, making sure each passenger was treated with equal care, in the way no one hesitated when handing Eleanor a first-class menu, in the way her champagne arrived promptly, chilled just as it should be. She settled into her seat, the hum of conversation around her fading into the background. She had fought no battle today. She had been given no reason to, and that was change. Eleanor never sought revenge. She never demanded an apology. She never raised her voice, even when she had every reason to. But she stood her ground. And because of that, an entire airline was forced to confront its own biases. She had never wanted the spotlight, but her actions had made a difference. Passengers who had once remained silent started speaking up. Flight attendants who had looked the other way now paid closer attention. Policies that had been ignored for years were now being enforced. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't a viral protest. But it was a shift. And small shifts add up. The changes within the airline spread beyond just one company. Other airlines took notice. News outlets covered the reforms. Passengers began sharing their own stories of subtle discrimination. And more importantly, companies realized they could no longer ignore it. A policy update here, a new training program there, small actions adding up in ways that couldn't be undone. Would the world suddenly become fair overnight? No. But the lesson was clear. People were watching. And if companies didn't do better, they would be held accountable. All because one woman refused to accept less than she deserved. Life often presents moments where we are tested, not by grand challenges, but by subtle injustices that demand a response. Eleanor Brooks's story reminds us that dignity is not given, but upheld by those who refuse to let others define their worth. She did not shout, retaliate, or seek revenge. She stood firm in who she was, allowing her presence and patience to force change. For many older adults, this lesson resonates deeply. Over a lifetime, we encounter moments where we must choose between silent endurance and quiet strength. Eleanor teaches us that demanding respect doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it is found in composure, resilience, and an unwavering belief in what is right. Change doesn't always come in loud protests or viral movements. Sometimes it begins with one person refusing to accept less than they deserve. And in doing so, they remind the world that justice is not just about fairness. It's about recognizing the worth of every individual. If this story inspired you, help us continue sharing powerful narratives of courage and dignity. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and let's keep these stories alive for generations to come.